evening, and welcome back to Center Stage at Beth Israel. I'm so honored to have as my guest tonight, Brian Balogh. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here.
Well, we're going to learn a lot about you and about this incredible book that you've just finished that's just been published. Let's start out just talking about Brian. How long have you lived in the Cleveland area?
I've lived in Cleveland for almost 2 years, a little short of 2 years.
And what brought you here, to this area?
My wife.
And you have grandchildren in this area as well?
I do have grandchildren. I think that brought us both to this area. And we also had lived in the country for a long time, and we both love cities. And my wife's a very fine artist, a painter, and wanted to be part of a bigger artist community, which you have here in Cleveland.
And let's go back a few years. Your undergraduate and graduate degrees are at the best, Harvard, Johns Hopkins. Was it always something? Was Harvard where you wanted to go to school?
Yeah, it was my first choice in the sense, the admission, the guidance people say, well, you need to say it was. I wanted to go to a good university, and it had a good reputation, and I wanted to go in a city. And so it was in Boston, Cambridge, technically.
Yeah, of course, across the river.
So it met the criteria.
And I've learned about your mom being over in Asia.
In Holland.
In Holland, in Europe. Were you born in Holland?
No. I was born in Miami, Florida.
Okay.
And so when I retired a year and a half ago, at my farewell party, there were no fewer than 5 jokes about who's born in Miami and retires to Cleveland.
Until today,
which has really ingratiated me to Cleveland people.
There you go. You came all the way up here. And what was your undergraduate degree in?
It was called government. It was really political science.
And did you always know you were going to keep going from there?
Quite the opposite. You mean going
educationally?
Hardly. No, I really wanted. I did study. I loved local politics, but politics in general.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be the guy who ran the city without having to run for election. So, deputy mayor. My first goal was to be deputy mayor of Boston because I was in Boston, and I did do an honors track, and my thesis advisor took me out. Mm-hmm. I remember it was called the Pamplona, little coffee place. Everybody smoked their cigarettes standing straight up, right off Harvard Square. Uh-huh. And wonderful thesis advisor. He's still teaching at Columbia. He moved to Columbia University from Harvard. And he said, where are you going to graduate school? And quote, graduate school, why would I ever want to go to graduate school?
My gosh.
And I don't know. My parents didn't go to college, and I revered my professors, probably way too much. But I wanted to do something. You'll laugh at me, Peter. I wanted to do something good for the world. And I don't know about that, but I ended up working in government a lot. And back in those days, there were those of us who thought government was a good thing, and you could actually help people by working in the government.
And where were you when you were doing this work?
Started in Boston, just with my college degree. And I did the budget for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Oh my gosh.
In the first Dukakis administration, Governor Dukakis. And I did the budget for income maintenance. Those are the cash assistance programs. And I had a girlfriend at the time who worked with Russian emigres, many of them Jewish, as you might imagine, and as your synagogue has done a lot for. And she was offered a job working with Russian emigres in New York City, the kind of big enchilada of Russian emigre work. And I said, sure, I'll move to New York. And the city happened to be going out of business. And I had budgeting skills, and so it was pretty easy for me to get a job. I worked for the Financial Control Board. I worked for City Council President Carol Bellamy, who's a wonderful political leader. She went on to run UNICEF. And then I worked very briefly for the Board of Education, handed in my resignation on the first day. The chancellor turned me down. He said, "You got to stay." I stayed for 6 months, but I went on and ran some welfare programs in New York City for a little over 2 years.
And when was the decision-making saying, I'm going to go back to school, which is something that was abhorrent to you years before?
I tried. Abhorrent is too strong.
Okay.
It just didn't seem right.
Okay.
So I loved my work. I loved all my jobs except the Board of Education. I really did. I had a passion for it. But I found that as soon as I knew what I was doing, I wasn't as interested. And that told me, I still did my job, I hope well, but that told me that there was an element of intellectual curiosity that I honestly had never thought that I had.
And those two words are the key to life, yes? Intellectual curiosity. I can go somewhere next.
Yeah, I don't know. They've been important to me.
Yeah.
Obviously, but in kind of hidden or unknown ways. It's one of those things that I kind of keep coming back to. I don't think of myself as an intellectual, and I don't think of myself as curious, but it turns out that I'm both.
And you made your way to Baltimore.
I did, much to the chagrin of my now wife, my girlfriend at the time, because I would come home from the welfare department with just great stories. I mean, she at the time was a writer. We met in a creative writing class. It's kind of out of a Woody Allen movie.
Yeah.
Well, I won't get into that. But, you know, the welfare department in New York City was a pretty insane place, very challenging.
Yeah.
But I really would come home with great stories, and all of a sudden, I'm a first-year graduate student at Johns Hopkins, and so I'd come home, and Kathy would ask me, "Well, what'd you do today?" I said, "I read a book."
Yeah.
And then she'd say, "What'd you do after that?" I said, "I read another book."
Yeah.
"Well, what were the books about?" You know, I can't really remember, but one was red and one was blue, and you know, that's just not as exciting as the stories that I'd come home with from welfare.
Was there a time ever when you questioned whether getting your PhD was the right thing for you?
Always.
Always.
I think the first year, Peter, was one of the tougher years in my life because I hadn't majored in history. I was all of a sudden in a very high-powered graduate program.
And what was the specific topic of your doctorate and all that history? Beyond the words history.
Yeah, I specialized in recent U.S. political history, and I wrote my dissertation, which became my first book, about, oddly enough, citizen participation, but citizen participation in very complex public policies. Nuclear power, to be specific. And it was really less about citizens and much more about experts, the politics of expertise.
And
really.
What year would that be?
That was published in, well, my dissertation was 88. I think that was the official date. I'd got my first job by then. And
where was that?
That was at Harvard.
So you went back to Harvard.
I went back to Harvard. It was the worst job in the profession because nobody had gotten tenure for 27 years.
Wow.
And the brilliant scholar who had preceded me, who I took his place, When he didn't get tenure, it was a story in the New York Times.
Got it.
He was that talented. So was everybody else who didn't get tenure. But that was the deal.
Yeah.
And after 27 years, you have to be quite the narcissist to think you're going to be the one.
Yeah.
So in today's terms, it would be considered kind of a very, very long postdoc, a 4-year postdoc. But I knew I wouldn't be staying there.
And how long were you there?
I was there, it was actually a 5-year contract, and I don't like moving. And so I didn't apply for jobs the first 3 years. And then in my 4th year, I tried to make my jailbreak, and I was fortunate that there were jobs I could apply for, and I took the job at the University of Virginia. So I was there for 4 years altogether.
When you go from Harvard, Boston, to Charlottesville, it's not just a geographic change. It's a humongous change city-wise and environment-wise, and you're a southern part of a southern state, and you're also due west of Washington and all that. That's a huge change, yes?
By then I was a pretty confirmed academic.
Okay.
I had published my first book, and there was a certain similarity between academic communities. So much of my life felt very similar, regardless of where it was geographically.
That's very interesting you say
Just
that.
as if you moved to Charlottesville.
Yeah.
My guess is you would get engaged in the synagogue there.
Yeah, okay.
And you would find real similarities
Yeah.
between that synagogue and this synagogue. In fact, I can already see some similarities. But so there would be some real continuity. And of course, my work has always been a big part of my life. So.
But it's interesting that you weren't just changing communities, you were changing employers and theories of employment and the way you were going to perform your work. There must have been a difference between Harvard and UVA, or you wouldn't have gone. Right?
Well, there were differences, but in the greater scheme of things, Peter, they were really quite subtle.
Is that right?
Yeah. The job as at the time, Harvard assistant professor, UVA an associate professor, the job is scholarship first. Writing, research, writing. That's generally about 50 to 60% of the job. Don't tell the state legislature that. And then teaching, both undergraduate and graduate. Now at Harvard, as an assistant professor, I wasn't supposed to teach graduate students, but they all flocked to me, not because I was so brilliant, and I should say us. There were about 5 or 6 suffering assistant professors who, with the exception of me, are now some of the top scholars in the world. And we weren't allowed formally to train graduate students, but of course, just like my own graduate students knew much more than me, we had just come out of graduate school, so we were really on top of the literature, we were really motivated. Let's just say some of my senior colleagues at Harvard were not quite as on top of the literature or as motivated.
So when you were teaching at UVA, what types of subject matter were you teaching?
Sure, I always taught about U.S. history.
From
1860? It was always 20th century.
Oh, 20th century, okay.
Yeah, I ended up writing about the 19th century, but I never taught, maybe, 1890s, but the long, as we call it, the long 20th century.
Okay.
And I taught about political history, but I tried to define it broadly. So I taught about environmental politics. I definitely talked about the history of science and technology, because I had just published a book on nuclear power.
Wow.
And I always had, really never published much on it, but always had a real interest in media and also in legal history. So I always worked those into my undergraduate courses.
Is it still the case for a professor at a major university to have at least 50% be the scholarship working on the next book?
It really varies according to the individual, especially after people get tenure.
Okay.
In a formal way, universities would say scholarship, teaching, and service. And in theory, maybe a third. But at a highly ranked university, a highly ranked department, in practice, you are measured by your scholarship, which is to say that you can be a absolutely brilliant scholar and a very mediocre to poor teacher, and you will get tenure. If it's reversed, you will not get tenure, even if you're a great teacher.
How long were you at UVA?
31 years.
You should be very proud of that, yes?
I am proud of it.
Yes.
Part of it, as I said, I don't like to move, so
No,
but I made a home there. I carved out a life there.
Yeah.
And what you might not know, and your viewers might not know, is that I loved my scholarship and I loved teaching and I did my share of service, but I happened to get involved with a podcast that was very popular. It was called Backstory, and we ripped a headline out of the newspaper every week, and we went into the history, and the topics ranged from the history of imprisonment. It was very much focused on the United States, history of imprisonment, and next week we might be doing the history of fashion. And you can see I shouldn't be doing the history of fashion.
The latter,
but
yeah.
Exactly.
Myself included.
So that became a very important part of my life, and we were on public radio, and it was a great way of learning history, to be honest. And I also started an international fellowship program that ended up funding 200 of the best scholars, finishing their dissertations in the world. And those folks have gone on to be leading scholars and teachers around the world. So I'm very proud of that. And it was also very useful to me to have these other things. And the common denominator really in both was interacting with people. I love engaging with people, and being a scholar can be very solitary. Teaching is engaging, but you're not always teaching. You give your lecture, and that's that. So those would I really lucked out with those two parts of my academic life.
And only having one of those would not have been fulfilling to you. Or less fulfilling, at least.
There are many times where I know that I would have written more books and more articles if I didn't do these other things, but having that kind of variety was very important to me. My father owned a jewelry store. He was a fabulous oboist. And he ended up, without a college degree, as a full professor of music at the University of Miami. So he always had these three parts of his life.
Well, in the back of the room is Dr. Fernandez. You may have not met him yet. He was a professor of economics at Oberlin. And I've always talked to him about...
I hope my wife didn't take his course for his sake.
About the idea of teaching. Just finished talking to the rabbi last week about teaching. And the week before that with Julian Russ about teaching. It's an extraordinary human thing to do.
It can be. And not everybody treats it that way, but it absolutely can be.
Yeah.
And to be honest, early in my career, and also coming out of my background at Johns Hopkins, teaching, that's something you have to do. And at Harvard, I had senior colleagues who told me I was spending too much time with students, which I wasn't, but to spend any time with students to them, and so, and early in my career, that's how I was trained, but that's where engaging with people comes in. Have never been able to stand up in front of a class and not get excited and not get engaged.
So you wrote a book about nuclear power.
Yes.
Wow. Tell us how you became interested in and what the subject matter of the book was.
Well, the argument in the book was that it was actually debates between experts that opened up an opportunity for citizen participation.
Got it.
Physicists, maybe you saw the Oppenheimer movie. Physicists, they were gods after the United States won World War II, in part because of the atomic bomb. And they were perceived broadly by the population as knowing everything, experts.
Wow.
And that wasn't just true in physics, that was true in medicine, that was probably true in law school, where you were trained, the law professor, they were the expert. It was a remarkable golden age for expertise. It was the deciding factor in winning the war. It kept us safe in the Cold War, in the race with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of deference to experts. There was a real downside to that, is experts aren't always right. They don't always listen to people. They might have benefited from the people. Anyway, the standard story was the civil rights movement came along, and the women's movement, and anti-war movements, and the people rose up and challenged all of these experts. My book argued that actually, before that even happened, it was experts arguing with each other that began to create openings for citizens like Ralph Nader to begin questioning expertise, and that the real challenge to experts came from other kinds of experts, especially people from a slightly different field of expertise, right? It's engineers challenging physicists. It's biologists beginning to challenge physicists about the biological impacts of radiation. It's an impenetrable book. I absolutely recommend it for anybody out there who's having trouble sleeping. It's called Chain Reaction, and it's a very scholarly book. It's the kind of book that gets you tenure.
So there was a defense secretary named McNamara.
There was.
Who was thought of as, what he said goes, and then Mr. Ellsberg decided, well, let me tell the truth about things like that. What
people don't recognize is Ellsberg was one of the leading experts in his field. The book that's often cited as starting the recent environmental movement is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carson was a real expert who worked in the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was one of the government agencies. And so it was people very knowledgeable beginning to challenge other people, which let the public see, maybe these experts aren't so invulnerable. Well, what do you know? They have debates between themselves. I mean, a lot of my book traced the debate between the safety people and the Atomic Energy Commission and the development people. But it was all kept behind closed doors. None of it was in the papers. We didn't have the internet, and we didn't have alternative outlets. So it was inaccessible to the average American.
But what you just said is critically important, though. It's also based upon the era in which they were working.
Absolutely.
I mean, the idea that we would have needed a Daniel Ellsberg in 2023 and 24, of course we wouldn't have needed Daniel Ellsberg. So it would have been out there. Somebody would have found it and thrown it up on the web, and it would have, you know what I'm saying? So it's just also the environment and the time in which they were operating.
Absolutely.
There was CBS News, ABC News, NBC News.
And you know what?
You know?
The other factor there, and scholars, it's not what I work on, but scholars have documented this, that expertise was limited to a very narrow demographic.
Intentionally
group.
so.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, educated white males. Now, experts are educated by definition, but you know, a great example is in medicine, what has happened in medicine by simply allowing more women to go to medical school, by taking women seriously. Well, what do you know? All of a sudden, women's diseases start being studied, and we can extrapolate from that to lots of other fields of expertise that were dominated by white men for hundreds of years in some cases.
So that's a very easy segue to the book. Because the protagonist, and by the way, I can't believe there's never been a book with that title before, because it seems like such an easy acronym, not in my backyard, like build it somewhere else. Who thought of the name for the book?
My editor thought of the name for the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I obviously thought about it.
Yeah.
But it was not my first choice.
How long does it take for this book? How long does it take to begin thinking about it, and then them making the book itself?
That is both a great question and an embarrassing one. So I would say I started hearing about this person who's the protagonist. Her name is Ray Ely. And I had moved out to the country, and we moved out in 2003. I would say I first heard about Ray in 2005 or 2006. And the stories about her were just wild. I heard that she had created this national historic landmark district. First of all, I realized that I lived in it.
Yes.
I didn't realize that when I moved out.
You were in that county. You
farm.
were in Louisa County.
I was in that county, and I was within this district. I hadn't really realized it. It's 14,000 acres.
Yes.
But that's, at the time, there were only 1,000. At the time she created, there were only 1,000 of these in the whole country, and they were places that you and I had heard of. The Alamo, Monticello, not Green Springs. So that seemed implausible to me. I heard that she had been involved in, the first battle I heard about was she had stopped this prison that was going to be built across from her, and that Governor Linwood Holton, who was a terrific governor of Virginia, and he was a Republican, but back in those days, especially in the South, the progressives often were Republicans. That she had stopped him. He was a very effective governor, so that seemed surprising. And then there were things like she had killed her husband. And that got my attention. Let me just say right now, she did not kill her husband. Her husband didn't even die, but there was a big fire in their house. And he was injured in the fire and could have died. And it was, people said, oh yeah, she started it, they hate it. You know. So I was intrigued. And I decided, okay, I'm going to talk to this woman. I was working on another book at the time. I finished one book, and I had been working on a book for a long time that I said, oh, now it's time to finish it. And I met Ray Ely, and I asked her if I could interview her. And I started talking to her, and the stories got wilder. But there was one difference. I actually started doing a tiny bit of research to just fact check some of the things, and everything she had told me turned out to be true.
Yes.
Right? She told me very quickly, that she hadn't killed her husband.
Yeah.
And I think so by now I'm guessing we're 2010 to answer your question.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
It's a that's why it's an embarrassing question to answer. And so I would say around 2000, I could go back and look at my emails and see, I would say around 2012, certainly more than 10 years ago, I decided I'm going to set this other book that will never now be finished. I'm going to set it aside because Ray was born in 1946, I think. Let's see. I think 1946. You learn very quickly as a historian that if you're doing interviews, you interview the oldest people first because of the progression of life.
Yeah.
And if I was going to write a book about Ray Ely, or just about these events, that I really better start in. So I started interviewing her in earnest, but I also started doing actual research in archives and that.
And how many times did you interview her?
Well over 30. Over 30.
So tell.
But there's just one more
Go
piece,
ahead.
and this is the intellect, the scholar in me.
Okay.
What really did it, because I couldn't see a scholarly angle here. I thought it was going to be a great story, but I just finished a book called The Associational State, and it's all about the way Americans like their government to work with and through both the private sector and the voluntary sector.
Got it.
These alliances between the three, and this national historic landmark that was created was built by one of these kinds of alliances.
Absolutely true.
Based on private easements donated to the
Yes.
national park, to the Department of Interior.
Yes.
So that intellectually I said, wow, what if I could. Nobody's ever read my scholarship. No reasonable human being. Scholars have. So what if I could wrap some political insights inside a story that you or that my friends who are not historians or scholars or my family, that they'd actually like to read the story and that's when I decided to write the book. I don't know if I've achieved that, but that's what I was trying to do.
So let's give our guests watching, the biography is, this woman is not born to money, not born to education. She's born, give us an idea of her early upbringing and the difficulties she had.
I'm so glad you asked that, because that's an important part of this story.
Absolutely.
This is a woman whose father drove fast cars and piloted fast boats for people who were reputedly got their money from illegal sources.
Well, fast boats in Miami would kind of give it away.
Untoward.
Yeah.
And it was even rumored that her father piloted a boat for Al Capone, and he did move down to Miami. So I can't prove that, but it's circumstantially, it's certainly a possibility. He was an alcoholic. He was abusive, and the protagonist, Ray Ely, showed up in middle school one day, and it was impossible to hide the results of that abuse. And she was sent to foster care in a prison-like facility. I've seen photographs of it, and I've read, ironically, Facebook posts today from the survivors of that facility. It was truly a horrible thing. And she was rescued by a Christian couple that would visit the prison or the foster care facility on a regular basis, and they took in foster kids.
Yes.
And that was her escape from this institution, but very sadly. And I cried when Ray told me she thought that they were adopting her. She didn't understand that she was going to be handed from foster family to foster family, which she was.
Took quite a period of time. You're just shipped from one to the next.
Exactly.
And at some period of time, when she's quite young, she kind of says, okay, I better start taking care of myself here, not depending upon somebody else to make my life better.
She said that internally, but she was still a kid, so
yes.
You know, she was still living with other families. And when she was about 15 years old, she was shipped off to the Vashti Industrial School for Girls.
Yeah, doesn't even sound nice.
It's not Choate or Exeter. Let's just put it that way. But she made the most of that, and I haven't been able to establish if it was accredited or not at the time, but she graduated or aged out of that, and she went to work for, I think it was a little finance company, and ended up marrying the manager of that. And being Ray Ely, she said to the guy, I'll marry you, but you have to give me $250. And the guy said, what for? She said, I think that's how much a divorce costs.
She even knew.
And she ended up using that money to get a divorce.
And she had her first child.
Soon after she had a first child, and he turned out to be not as physically abusive as her father, but clearly abusive and threatening.
And how does she meet her husband that takes us through her journey in the book?
Right. His name was Colonel Hiram Ely. His family came over on the Mayflower. He was a very distinguished officer. He worked on acoustics and worked with Helen Keller, worked at Bell Labs.
And 40 years older than she is.
45 years older.
Yeah.
To answer your question, Ray always loved dogs, and her landlady, she lived above her landlady in Georgia, where this school was. And after she got rid of her husband, moved in above her landlady, they would read these dog breeding magazines. And Ray saw that that a fairly prominent breeder of dachshunds had a heart attack at the New York Dog Show and subsequently passed away, and that her husband was looking for dachshunds to breed the dogs with. And this is the part that I love the most. Ray rented, because what are the odds?
Yeah.
Ray rented 2 dachshunds, got on a train, went up to New Jersey, and she was married to Colonel Ely within really 3 or 4 months after that.
And they made
It was love at first sight.
And they made their way to is it Louisa?
It's Louisa County.
Louisa County, which is an hour west of Charlottesville? Back then, maybe?
It's east, and it's not even.
Okay.
Maybe a half hour east of Charlottesville.
It's my understanding that the reason they go there is because they want to live in a beautiful, calm, quiet, quaint, country
You are a very careful reader.
environment.
You're the kind of reader I like.
And tell us what happens that changed her life.
Well, literally, they're watching the evening news.
Yeah, literally.
On their big Magnavox television
Yeah.
station. It's the spring, the windows are open, beginning to see cherry blossoms. And the newscaster comes on and says that Governor Holton is going to finally do something about this monstrosity of a penitentiary in Richmond, and it really was a monstrosity. And he wants to build a diagnostic center where every felon, every convicted felon will be sent there first to get a really good diagnosis. And he wanted a place that was close to a good medical school where people could be really evaluated by experts. And it was going to be located a few miles from Zion Crossroads in Louisa County. And Ray looks at her husband and said, wait a second, that's across the street from us. And then they thought back and they realized they had seen government cars driving through.
Oh my gosh.
They had seen a government helicopter. You know, they hadn't noticed it at the time, but they put two and two together and they realized there's going to be this maximum security facility. Now, I want to be very clear. This was, again, Holton is a Republican, but this was a very progressive measure. It could have been out of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And it was part of what, in my opinion, sadly, was one of the last waves of actually trying to rehabilitate prison. Very soon, rising crime was going to convince most Americans to, put them away, throw away the key, mandatory sense of so you know how it went.
Here's Ray, high school educated.
Maybe.
At least she transported her way through high school. How's that? Who somehow figures out, wait a minute, we're going to form a neighborhood group and we're going to stop this thing.
Well, what Ray would have said at the time, and I'm sure did say, was, well, what she did say was, Hiram, what are you going to do about it?
To her husband.
To her husband. What she simply assumed, and what happened, was the men organized and they tried to stop it. And they said, Hiram said things like, you didn't tell us about it. A gentleman would have stopped by to say we're building a prison. You never did that, right? And they weren't getting anywhere. And Ray, being Ray, slowly began to get more and more involved. But even after the first year, when her whole life was devoted to stopping this prison, she couldn't imagine that she would become, that she was, like she already in effect was. Hiram was much older. He didn't relate to reporters as well. My guess is his energy was also lagging, and he had this 20-something wife turning 30 who was just a dynamo in every sense of the word.
And this is a woman who is a dynamo. At the same time, women are not dynamos. Women are still supposed to be in the kitchen.
They're not acknowledged as...
They're supposed to be taking their kids to school and keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, and now...
Especially down there in the South. I mean, is that fair? That was this idea behind a woman's role?
But that's a fair generalization.
Yeah.
I think the more evidentiary-based way to put it is that every area that Ray entered in order to stop this prison was all virtually all male. The only exception was there was a female reporter for the Washington Post who covered this, and there were a few female reporters at some of the smaller local.
Yeah.
But in general, the press and the media were completely male.
Yeah. Politicians were male.
Politicians were, every politician she dealt with
Yeah.
was male, and every lawyer, every judge, and every administrator, with one exception.
And the idea that the protagonist herself would be a female was unheard of. There was no historical basis for it. Is that fair in that area?
No.
I take it back then.
No, it is a
Okay.
totally reasonable presumption. In fact, there have always been women leaders so let's just take the civil rights movement. There's a long history of female leadership. Okay. You know Martin Luther King, we're celebrating his birthday tomorrow, but in fact, at the local level, there had always been female leaders of the civil rights movement. So
Okay.
it wasn't unheard of, and in fact, what my book is about is really how many white middle class women got involved in politics
Yeah.
and became active in politics. In unions, there were female leaders. Now, you don't know about them because they haven't been written about as much, just like people don't know about Ray Ely until I wrote my book.
Yeah. So somehow she learns at an amazing pace
Yes.
and finds a way to convince enough people to, first of all, give this the attention it needed to be given.
Yes.
Because generally a politician's attention span is only as long as the check that's written to them or thereabouts. I mean, they move around a lot. So not only did she get their attention, but she won.
She did help. She and
her group.
and her group
And her lawyers.
people,
And-
yeah, exactly.
They won.
They outlasted
Yeah.
Governor.
And the idea
Bolton.
was, we're going to give the government an easement on our property so they have a part of this process. Am I being oversimplistic when I say that?
No, that was key to
Yes.
creating the National Historic Landmark.
Yes.
And once she created National Historic Landmark, it became harder to place a prison
Yeah.
in the middle of it. And yes, you got that right, and
Yeah.
you are an attorney. But once the Department of Interior held those easements, then it had a legal basis to
Yeah.
protect. They were very worried about it. Once it became a landmark, they had an obligation to protect it. And it was kind of, she faced a lot of resistance in Interior. They, back in the New Deal, could simply go create a national park. In the case of Virginia, Shenandoah National Park. And they appropriated money and they took over thousands of acres to create a national day. They owned it. This idea of easements they were very uncomfortable with, and they were really quite worried about it because they knew they needed to protect it, but that could become very expensive. They knew it was less expensive than buying all this land, but they had to protect it, and that might mean getting involved and paying a lot of money and a lot of litigation. So she met a lot of resistance within the land guys within the Interior Department were not so keen on her.
It seemed like a constant flow underneath the story was the amazing complexity of the local, county, state, and federal bureaucracy that she had to somehow meander through from day one.
She figured it out.
She went through not just the governor's office and the county offices, but all the different federal, state, local governmental agencies that all came around to say, she's right.
All except those that wanted to build a prison.
Of course.
But yes, you're absolutely right, Peter, and a very good example is the way she used the environmental impact statement.
Which hadn't been done before, right?
Historians could never say it hadn't been done before if they haven't looked at everything.
Got it.
Odds are it has been done, but what she did was she went to every agency that was tasked with commenting, and she made sure that the comments were negative. I mean, in some cases, she literally wrote the comments and gave them the basis for
Which is
creating.
amazing to think that I hate to use the word common person, but a common person could do all that.
Yeah, it's important to remember, she has only a high school education.
So there's two more areas we're going to cover. One is the fact about where her education actually took her as this whole process is going on, because she ends up being much more than just someone with a high school education.
Yes.
Describe that.
Well, there was an interim step. She went to, now I'm forgetting, the Great Books College in Annapolis, I think. Is it St. John's? I'm blocking on the name.
Yeah.
And she went there, took her youngest kid. The other two kids stayed with Hiram. And in fairness to Hiram, it's very important to point out that he did the bulk of childcare.
She was gone
during
all the time.
She was gone.
Yeah.
She was lobbying.
Yeah.
She often stayed over in Washington or in Richmond in order to lobby. Anyway, she went to college, and she not only went to college, but being Ray Ely, she applied for a Truman scholarship. I've written letters for Truman scholars. They're the best of the best.
Okay.
And it comes with, if you win this, which she did.
She did, of course.
They give you, they pay for your graduate education. Now, being Ray, even though she had only finished 2 years, she decided, well, great, now she can go to law school.
Right.
And people pointed out, you kind of have to finish college for not Ray Ely.
Not Ray.
So she became the first person in living memory to be accepted, not just at any law school, but at the University of Virginia School of Law.
Thomas Jefferson School.
To be accepted without a college degree.
Unheard of.
And she ended up getting her law degree, and she practiced law in Louisa County for decades.
Isn't that extraordinary?
After that.
And the last issue is, she didn't just take on government. She took on a little company called W.R. Grace that thought that they would, what W.R. Grace does, they thought they would do a little mining in the area.
Yeah.
And she went through the whole process again with trying to say, not in my backyard. You're not going to dig up like you did in Montana and other places. This is our community.
So in this case, and she won again with W.R. Grace. In this case, she had met Peter Grace, the CEO.
The Peter Grace.
The Peter Grace. She had met him when she stood up at a shareholder. She bought 2 shares.
Just to be able to attend.
Just to be able to attend. In 1976, she stood up, and they were ready for her. They had already heard about her. And she is met by a phalanx of security and lawyers who really expected her to arrive with a whole cadre of angry women. She arrived, in her words, dressed as a fairy princess, alone. And she went, took a seat, and as soon as they took comment, she stood up, and Peter Grace had been alerted. He said, Mrs. Ely, and he's like girding himself. And she said, I just want to thank you for all the wonderful things. Now, they desperately wanted to strip mine in Green Springs, but
Yes.
she just turned it around. She said, I think it's so great that you are not going to strip mine in Green Springs. You know, she's thinking, what are you talking about? Whatever, but what's he going to say, right? And the whole auditorium, she gets a standing ovation. People think it's great. Now, they went ahead anyway and stripped mine, and so we fast forward 15 years. She goes to another, she didn't go to the shareholder meeting, she found out where it was, and she figured out where Peter Grace must be staying at a hotel, and she positioned herself
Yes.
in the lobby.
Yes.
And he comes back in his limousine, and she, quote, bumps into him. Oh, Mr. Grace. Oh, Miss Ely. And she says, you know, I just have a little favor of you to ask. Of course, he's probably had a few drinks. Of course, Miss Ely, anything for you. And he said, look, you know that land we've been arguing about for 15 years? Well, why don't you just give it to my organization?
Yeah.
And he said, you know, that's not a bad idea.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, well, this is, we are in the synagogue.
Yeah.
This is chutzpah.
This is chutzpah.
And she is not Jewish.
Yeah, and I mean, the way you portray it is just as you said it. I mean, there's no issue here of uncommon ground.
No.
I mean, this is the protagonist versus Fortune 500. And little by little, even that, she wins. She gets them to stop, and the easements and everything comes over. And at the end of your amazing book, she's just practicing law, helping people enjoy their lives. Having taken on government and then taken on corporate America, she's 2-0. She made it through both of those.
She definitely made it through those. And I can assure you that as we speak, she's following the news to see what's happening with the scarce resource called water.
Yeah.
The water that makes Green Springs green.
Green.
And I promise you that she will get engaged well into her 80s if there's any threat. And I think there are lots of lessons in this book, but one lesson is the value of focusing on 14,000 acres.
Yeah.
She lectured at all kinds of fancy universities. She consulted with people, but her passion for her entire life since 1970 has been protecting this 14,000 acres.
Yes.
And, you know, we're all tempted to go bigger and larger, and there's really something to be said about concentrating on what you care about most.
And to bring this to summation, as a scholar, as an author, how much fun is it to just tell a great story like this? It must have been remarkable to do this book.
Well, it certainly was a unique experience for me, although in our podcast we always tried to tell stories. But
yeah, this is a story.
It is, that's the greatest compliment you can give me, but you know, when you start, it's not a story.
Yeah.
And so it has been a joy to put the pieces together in a form that at least you believe is a story.
I'm convinced. So I want everybody to understand that I read this in 5 days, and I didn't read it just because I'm Brian's friend, but I read it because the story itself is tremendous. And the inner workings of government and this one woman's straight line to being the righteous one in the group is an extraordinary story.
Well, thank you,
And
Peter.
I thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all very much for watching. This is Beth Israel, Center Stage. And next month we're going to come back with a judge and one of the great lawyers in the community. Thank you very much.